My friends, when we look out at the world in 2025, we see a global stage that's more complex, more connected, and more competitive than ever before. And in the middle of that stage, we see two great democracies: the United States of America and the Republic of India, both nations proud, both nations diverse, both nations with dreams as big as the world itself. Now, folks might be asking, why is India standing up to the United States? Why now? Why here? Well, the answer isn't about hostility or rivalry for rivalry's sake. It's about maturity. It's about a nation that has grown in confidence, in capability, and in conviction. For decades, India's economic rise has been steady and determined. It's become a hub of innovation, a global supplier of technology, pharmaceuticals, and talent. And when a nation reaches that point, when it can feed its people, educate its youth, launch its satellites into orbit, it begins to see itself not as a follower in the world order, but as a shaper of it. There's also a matter of geography and history. India sits at the heart of Asia, surrounded by opportunities and challenges that the United States can't fully experience from across the ocean. That means when India speaks up about regional security, trade routes, or the rules of technology and energy, it speaks with the authority of one who lives in the neighborhood. But let's be clear, standing up doesn't mean walking away. It means engaging on equal terms. It means saying, we respect you, but we will chart our own course. And in a healthy international community, that's a good thing. It forces all of us, Americans, Indians, and others, to listen more, to compromise more, and to find solutions that respect the dignity of all peoples. Because in the end, the measure of a partnership isn't whether one side always agrees with the other. It's whether both sides can disagree and still work together toward the common good. And I truly believe that the U.S. and India can do that. Not just because of what we have in common, but because of the vision we share for a world that is more free, more prosperous, and more just. Thank you. India's growing economic strength and self-reliance in 2025 are not sudden phenomena. They are the result of decades of calculated policy, societal transformation, and resilience in the face of global pressures. To understand why this economic rise has translated into greater independence from the United States, it's necessary to look at how India's economic journey has evolved, how its domestic capabilities have matured, and how global economic trends have shifted the balance of power. In the late 20th century, India's economy was largely inward-looking, protected by high tariffs and guided by centralized planning. The liberalization reforms of the early 1990s marked the turning point. By opening its markets, deregulating industries, and attracting foreign investment, India positioned itself for sustained growth. Over the next 3 decades, the country steadily increased its share of global GDP, driven by a young workforce, a rapidly expanding services sector, and significant growth in manufacturing and exports. By the early 2020s, India had moved firmly into the ranks of the world's top 5 economies. This economic momentum meant that India could increasingly fund its own development without depending heavily on foreign loans or aid from institutions historically influenced by the United States. In earlier decades, financial assistance often came with policy prescriptions aligned with American economic philosophy. By 2025, India had the fiscal capacity and foreign exchange reserves to chart its own economic course, reducing susceptibility to external pressure. This shift is crucial because economic self-reliance directly impacts political autonomy. A nation that can sustain itself financially is far less likely to be swayed by the promise or withdrawal of foreign funds. A key element of India's economic resilience is its diversification of trade and investment sources. Instead of relying predominantly on the United States and Western markets, India has cultivated deep economic ties with Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Energy deals with Gulf nations, technology collaborations with East Asia, and agricultural exports to African markets have lessened the risk of economic dependency on any single country. This diversification has provided India with both leverage and security, the ability to say no to policies or agreements that conflict with its long-term interests without fearing a crippling economic backlash. The digital revolution has also been central to India's economic independence. Homegrown technology firms, advancements in digital payment systems, and innovations in artificial intelligence and biotechnology have made India a global competitor in sectors traditionally dominated by the United States and China. The success of India's unified payments interface, UPI, for example, has become a model for other nations, reducing the influence of foreign payment systems. Similarly, India's strides in renewable energy technology, particularly in solar manufacturing and green hydrogen, have positioned it as a leader in the global energy transition. The more a country innovates within its borders, the less it needs to import high-value technologies, which in turn strengthens its negotiating position in international agreements. Domestic manufacturing has also played a significant role. The Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat, a self-reliant India initiatives once seen as aspirational slogans, have matured into concrete policies that have bolstered India's industrial base. From defense equipment to pharmaceuticals, India has expanded its capacity to produce what it once imported. This is especially visible in the pharmaceutical sector, where India is not just self-sufficient in producing essential medicines, but is also a major exporter to both developed and developing nations. By becoming a net provider rather than a net importer, India has reduced a critical avenue of dependency. Another often overlooked dimension is India's demographic advantage. With a median age significantly younger than that of the United States, Europe or China, India's labor force is both large and dynamic. This youthful workforce fuels domestic consumption and provides the human capital needed for sustained economic expansion. As consumer markets within India grow, the country becomes less reliant on exports to the United States for economic vitality. This inward demand is a powerful shield against external economic pressures. Moreover, India's economic rise has coincided with a multipolar shift in the global economy. The post-Cold War era of U.S. economic dominance has given way to a more complex web of interdependence, where countries like India, Brazil, and Indonesia wield greater influence. This diffusion of power means that the United States can no longer unilaterally set global trade or financial rules without facing pushback from rising economies. India's participation in alternative trade blocs and multilateral organizations such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization underscores its willingness to operate outside traditional U.S.-led structures when necessary. Self-reliance, however, is not simply about producing more at home. It is about having the institutional strength to make sovereign decisions without fear of economic retaliation. India has invested heavily in domestic financial infrastructure, from expanding rural banking networks to modernizing stock exchanges. The Reserve Bank of India has built robust mechanisms to manage currency fluctuations and inflation, giving the country more stability during times of global economic volatility. This internal stability reduces the leverage any single external power, including the United States, can exert over India's economy. Additionally, India's approach to foreign investment has evolved. While it remains open to American capital, it has set clearer terms to ensure that critical sectors remain under domestic control. restrictions on foreign ownership in sensitive industries, the encouragement of joint ventures with Indian firms, and the promotion of domestic startups all reflect a more strategic approach to globalization. This is not isolationism, but rather a calibrated integration into the world economy, one where India engages on its own terms. By 2025, India's economic partnerships reflect a confident, selective approach, whether negotiating defense purchases, technology transfers, or trade agreements. India is no longer in the position of accepting terms for fear of losing investment or market access. Instead, it weighs each agreement against its national interest and is willing to walk away when the terms are unfavorable. This capacity to walk away is one of the clearest indicators of genuine independence. It's also worth noting the cultural dimension of economic self-reliance. Economic power has fostered a renewed sense of national pride and identity, influencing public opinion and, in turn, government policy. Indian citizens, increasingly aware of their country's capabilities, support leaders who take strong stances in international negotiations, even if it leads to friction with powerful countries like the United States. In democratic societies, public sentiment matters, and a self-assured electorate is less likely to accept perceived subservience to foreign interests. Finally, all of these factors, the economic diversification, technological innovation, manufacturing growth, demographic strength, institutional stability, and cultural confidence come together to create a foundation for an independent foreign policy. When a nation has the resources and resilience to weather economic storms, it can prioritize long-term strategic interests over short-term concessions. And that is precisely the position India finds itself in by 2025, a nation that can afford to stand up for its own vision of the future, even when it differs from that of the United States. Strategic differences between India and the United States in 2025 stem from a combination of geography, history, and evolving national priorities. While both countries are democracies with shared values such as pluralism and rule of law, the realities of their strategic environments have led them to approach global and regional issues in ways that do not always align. These differences are neither accidental nor entirely new. They are the natural outcome of two sovereign powers defining their place in an increasingly complex and multipolar world. India's geographic position shapes much of its strategic thinking. Situated in South Asia, bordered by China to the north and Pakistan to the west, and with maritime interests stretching across the Indian Ocean, India's security priorities are inherently different from those of the United States, whose main strategic focus historically spans across the Atlantic and Pacific. For India, the stability of its immediate neighborhood is paramount. Threats from cross-border terrorism, regional conflicts, and border disputes directly influence how it allocates military resources and chooses its alliances. This focus on local and regional challenges often means that India will not automatically align with U.S. strategic goals that are primarily global in scope. One clear example is India's approach to China. While the United States sees China as its principal global rival in military, economic, and technological spheres, India's relationship with China is far more complex. It is a relationship defined not only by competition and mistrust, but also by trade and economic interdependence. Even amid serious border tensions in places like Ladakh, India maintains a significant volume of bilateral trade with China. The United States, by contrast, has leaned toward economic decoupling in key sectors. For India, completely severing ties with China would come at high economic cost and could destabilize the broader region, a risk that New Delhi is unwilling to take unless absolutely necessary. India's military posture further reflects these differences. The United States projects power globally maintaining bases and forces in dozens of countries. India, however, has historically adopted a policy of strategic restraint, focusing on defending its borders and maintaining influence within the Indian Ocean region. While India has deepened defense cooperation with the U.S. through joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and arms purchases, it has resisted any arrangement that might be perceived as a formal military alliance. This reluctance is rooted in India's long-standing policy of non-alignment, which, although adapted over time, still informs its desire to retain autonomy in military decision-making. Another area of divergence is how each country approaches multilateral diplomacy. The United States, while participating in global institutions, has often preferred to lead coalitions where it sets the strategic agenda. India, by contrast, emphasizes a multipolar order where no single power dominates. This philosophy has driven India to participate actively in diverse forums such as BRIAS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20, alongside its partnerships with Western nations. From New Delhi's perspective, a balance of power among multiple centers, rather than alignment with a single bloc, better protects its sovereignty and allows it to navigate shifting alliances in the 21st century. Energy policy illustrates another strategic difference. The United States, in its push to limit the influence of adversarial states, has imposed sanctions on countries such as Iran and Russia. India, however, has been unwilling to fully comply when it believes doing so would harm its own energy security. In 2025, India continues to import oil from Russia at discounted rates, citing affordability and the need to meet domestic demand. While Washington views such trade as undercutting its sanctions policy, India frames it as a sovereign decision based on its developmental priorities. This is a fundamental clash between a global strategy aimed at enforcing norms and a regional strategy aimed at ensuring economic stability. Technology governance is another domain where the two nations have differing visions. The U.S. has pushed for tighter controls over emerging technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, and semiconductor supply chains, often framed around preventing Chinese dominance. India agrees on the importance of security in technology, but places equal emphasis on accessibility and affordability for its massive population. This has led India to pursue technology partnerships with a variety of countries, not exclusively the United States, and to invest heavily in domestic innovation ecosystems that reduce dependence on any single foreign source. In some cases, India has even declined to fully align with U.S. restrictions, opting instead for a case-by-case evaluation of partners. Their differences extend to global governance reform. India has long advocated for structural changes in institutions like the United Nations Security Council, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund to better represent the realities of today's global power distribution. While the United States has voiced support in principle, it has been cautious in backing reforms that might significantly dilute its influence. For India, these reforms are not just abstract ideals, but concrete steps toward ensuring that decision-making in global institutions reflects the voices and interests of emerging economies. The lack of urgency on the part of the U.S. in advancing these reforms has been a source of quiet frustration in New Delhi. Domestic politics in both countries also play a role in shaping these strategic differences. In the U.S., foreign policy toward India must navigate a complex web of domestic constituencies, including those concerned about human rights, trade imbalances, and geopolitical competition with China. In India, political leaders respond to a public that increasingly values strategic autonomy and resists any perception of being subordinate to foreign powers. This domestic pressure makes both sides cautious about appearing too accommodating to the other's agenda, even when cooperation is possible. The management of regional conflicts is another area where perspectives diverge. The United States has, at times, been willing to take military or economic action far from its shores to address perceived threats or uphold international norms. India, in contrast, is more selective, choosing involvement only in cases where its direct interests are at stake. This approach is not isolationist but pragmatic, shaped by resource constraints and the need to prioritize immediate security challenges over distant crises. Despite these differences, it's important to recognize that they do not necessarily weaken the relationship. Strategic differences are natural between two large, independent powers with distinct histories and geographies. What matters is how these differences are managed. In 2025, India's willingness to diverge from the U.S. position reflects confidence in its own capabilities and an understanding that alignment should be based on mutual interest, not obligation. For Washington, these differences are a reminder that partnerships in the 21st century must be flexible and rooted in respect for each partner's strategic priorities. Ultimately, the divergence in strategic approaches between India and the United States is not a sign of a broken relationship, but of a mature one. Both nations have reached a point where they can cooperate in areas of shared interest, such as counterterrorism, climate change, and maritime security, while maintaining distinct positions where their priorities differ. This dynamic, while sometimes a source of tension, also ensures that the partnership is based on equality rather than dependency. And in the long run, such a foundation may prove more durable than alliances built solely on temporary alignment. The shift in the global power balance in 2025 is one of the most significant factors behind India's evolving posture toward the United States. For much of the post-Cold War era, the United States held a position of near unquestioned dominance in international politics, economics, and security. Many nations, including India, oriented large parts of their foreign policy around maintaining favorable relations with Washington. But the last 2 decades have transformed the world into something far more complex, a genuinely multipolar environment where economic influence, technological leadership, and security partnerships are distributed across several key centers of power. In this new reality, India has sought to widen its network of relationships beyond traditional Western allies, not as a rejection of the United States, but as a strategic adaptation to the demands of a more fluid world order. The most visible driver of this shift is the economic rise of multiple regions. China, despite its slowing growth, remains a formidable economic force and a critical trading partner for many countries. The European Union, while grappling with its own internal challenges, is still a major player in global markets. Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America have experienced steady economic expansion, and with that growth has come a more assertive voice in international forums. For India, this redistribution of economic weight means that opportunities for trade, investment, and political alignment are no longer concentrated in 1 or 2 capitals. Instead, they are spread across dozens of nations, each with its own set of interests and capabilities. India's foreign policy has responded to this landscape by adopting what can be described as multi-alignment. Rather than tying itself too closely to one bloc, India engages with multiple centers of influence simultaneously, forming partnerships based on specific issues rather than broad ideological alignment. This approach allows India to cooperate with the United States on defense and counterterrorism, deepen economic ties with the European Union, invest in infrastructure projects with Japan, import discounted energy from Russia, and collaborate with African nations on agricultural technology, all without committing to any single overarching alliance that could limit its flexibility. By diversifying its partnerships in this way, India reduces the risk of being caught in the middle of great power rivalries. Energy security has been a critical area where this broader engagement has brought India into occasional friction with U.S. interests. As global energy markets shift, India has sought to secure reliable, affordable supplies from multiple sources, even when those suppliers, such as Russia or Iran, are at odds with Washington. For the United States, these relationships can appear as challenges to its sanction regimes or diplomatic efforts. But for India, they are calculated decisions to safeguard its energy needs in a world where energy costs have a direct impact on domestic economic stability. In an interconnected global economy, no nation can afford to ignore the reality of supply diversification, and India's choices reflect that logic. Technology and innovation are another domain where the shift in global power dynamics is shaping India's strategy. The United States has long been the primary destination for Indian students, researchers, and technology professionals, and it remains a major hub for high-tech innovation. But in recent years, India has expanded its scientific collaborations to include not just Western partners, but also East Asian countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, as well as emerging innovation centers in Africa and Latin America. By building a web of partnerships, India is positioning itself as both a consumer and a producer of advanced technologies, with the ability to draw on expertise from around the world rather than relying on a single source. The rebalancing of power is not only economic and technological, it is also institutional. International organizations that were once dominated by a few Western powers are now under increasing pressure to adapt to the multipolar reality. India has played an active role in this transformation, using platforms like the Barais Group, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the International Solar Alliance to promote initiatives that reflect the priorities of the Global South. In these forums, India often works alongside countries that have tense relations with the United States, not as an act of defiance, but because those partnerships serve its developmental and strategic objectives. This willingness to collaborate outside the traditional U.S.-led system is a direct reflection of the more distributed nature of global influence. India's expanding defense relationships also illustrate this change. While the United States remains an important defense partner, India has simultaneously increased arms purchases from France, expanded naval cooperation with Australia and Japan, and explored joint defense production with Israel and Russia. This diversified approach ensures that India's military modernization is not dependent on any one country's policies or supply chains. In the past, reliance on a single supplier could leave a country vulnerable to political shifts or export restrictions. In the current environment, India's diversified defense ties provide resilience and freedom of action. Cultural diplomacy and people-to-people connections have similarly broadened beyond the U.S.-India relationship. Indian diaspora communities have long been influential in America, but in recent years, large Indian communities in the Gulf states, the United Kingdom, Canada, and parts of Africa have also become important channels for diplomacy and trade. These diverse diaspora linkages mean that India's international relationships are rooted in multiple societies around the world, giving it both economic and political leverage in regions far beyond its immediate neighborhood. The very idea of standing up to the United States in this context must be understood as part of a larger process of asserting a more independent role in a multipolar world. In earlier eras, when the United States was the unquestioned center of gravity, aligning with Washington on most major issues was often the default for countries seeking growth and security. But in 2025, alignment is no longer automatic. countries like India now weigh each issue on its merits, balancing the potential benefits of cooperation with the risks of over-dependence. This change is not unique to India. It is happening across much of the global South, but India's size, economy, and geopolitical position make its actions especially consequential. There is also a psychological dimension to this shift. Rising powers gain confidence not only from economic and military capacity, but from the recognition they receive on the world stage. In recent years, India has been increasingly acknowledged as a critical player in addressing global challenges, from climate change to pandemic preparedness to digital governance. Such recognition reinforces the belief among Indian policymakers and the public that their country should not simply follow the lead of any single power, however friendly. This confidence, when combined with the structural changes in global power, naturally produces a more assertive and independent stance. At the same time, the United States is adjusting to this reality. Washington recognizes that in a multipolar world, influence must be earned through partnership and persuasion rather than assumed as a given. This makes U.S.-India relations more complex, but potentially more equal and sustainable in the long term. It also means that points of disagreement are more visible because neither side feels compelled to hide them in the interest of maintaining an unequal relationship. Ultimately, the redistribution of global power has opened new possibilities for India to define its place in the international system. The country's decision to expand partnerships beyond traditional Western allies is not an abandonment of its relationship with the United States, but a natural adaptation to a world in which no single nation holds all the keys to prosperity or security. In this environment, India seeks to be a bridge connecting East and West, North and South, while safeguarding its autonomy. Standing up to the United States when necessary is part of maintaining that balance and reflects a world where the center of gravity is no longer fixed in one place, but shared among many. Domestic political pressures in both India and the United States in 2025 play a decisive role in shaping the assertive Indian stance seen in diplomatic negotiations with Washington. While international relations are often framed in terms of grand strategy, economic interests, and security imperatives, the reality is that foreign policy is deeply influenced by the internal political environment of each country. Leaders make decisions not only based on what they believe is strategically wise, but also on what will resonate with their domestic audiences, satisfy key constituencies, and strengthen their position in the political landscape. In India, public opinion has shifted significantly over the past 2 decades. A combination of economic growth, technological achievement, and global recognition has fostered a strong sense of national pride. Citizens increasingly see India as a country that deserves to be treated as an equal on the world stage, not as a junior partner to any great power. This sentiment has been amplified by political narratives that emphasize self-reliance, sovereignty, and historical resilience. In such an environment, any perception of yielding to foreign pressure, especially from a powerful nation like the United States, can be politically costly for the government in power. This makes Indian leaders more inclined to take firm stances in negotiations, even when it risks short-term friction. Media and public discourse in India also shape this dynamic. The rise of digital platforms and a highly engaged online population means that foreign policy decisions are scrutinized in real time. When the government takes a strong stand in an international dispute or pushes back against external demands, it often receives an immediate boost in public approval. Conversely, appearing too accommodating to U.S. positions can trigger criticism from both political rivals and the public, who may interpret it as compromising national dignity. These domestic optics become especially important in the run up to elections, where foreign policy achievements can be framed as evidence of leadership strength. Political pressures are not one-sided. In the United States, foreign policy toward India is influenced by domestic considerations as well. Different administrations have to balance strategic engagement with India against other priorities, including relations with China, commitments to allies in Europe, and domestic political debates on trade, human rights, and immigration. U.S. lawmakers, advocacy groups, and media outlets may pressure the government to address certain issues in the bilateral relationship, such as market access for American goods, intellectual property protections, or human rights concerns. These pressures can lead Washington to adopt positions that, while intended to appeal to domestic constituencies, may be perceived in India as overreach or interference. Trade negotiations provide a clear example of how domestic politics drive positions on both sides. In the United States, industries that export to India often lobby for lower tariffs and fewer restrictions, while labor unions may demand that trade agreements protect American jobs. In India, domestic manufacturers, farmers, and service providers push for protections against foreign competition. When both governments are under pressure from these constituencies, it becomes harder to make concessions, even when they would serve broader strategic interests. The result is a more assertive negotiating stance, where each side seeks to extract maximum benefit without appearing to have given in to the other. Defense cooperation is another area where domestic political pressures come into play. In India, there is broad public support for modernizing the military, but also a desire to ensure that procurement decisions are not perceived as favoring one foreign supplier at the expense of domestic industry. U.S. defense contractors may lobby heavily for sales to India, and members of Congress from districts with strong defense manufacturing bases may push for agreements that secure jobs at home. Balancing these domestic pressures means that even shared security goals can be complicated by economic and political considerations, leading to protracted negotiations. Cultural and ideological factors also contribute to the political environment shaping these interactions. In India, the political leadership often frames foreign policy within the context of civilizational identity and national destiny, reinforcing the idea that India should act as an independent power rather than following the lead of any other nation. In the United States, there is a long-standing tradition of promoting democratic values and human rights abroad, which can sometimes lead to public or congressional calls to speak out on issues within India. While these perspectives are rooted in each country's political culture, they can create points of friction when leaders feel compelled to respond to domestic demands, even at the risk of straining bilateral ties. Immigration policy is another area where domestic politics intersect with the bilateral relationship. The large Indian diaspora in the United States contributes to American society in many ways, particularly in technology and healthcare. However, domestic debates over immigration quotas, work visas, and labor market impacts can influence how immigration-related negotiations proceed. Indian leaders, mindful of the importance of the diaspora, both as an economic bridge and as a political constituency at home, may press Washington for more favorable policies. At the same time, U.S. policymakers must weigh these requests against domestic concerns about immigration reform. The electoral cycles in both countries also play a role. In democratic systems, leaders are acutely aware of how foreign policy decisions will be perceived by voters. A strong, independent stance toward a powerful partner can be presented as evidence of leadership and vision. For India, this might mean publicly rejecting a trade condition that is seen as unfavorable, or declining to participate in a military operation that does not align with national interests. For the United States, this might mean taking a firm line on market access or intellectual property protections, even if it slows progress in other areas of the relationship. Domestic political pressures can also lead to moments of symbolic defiance that carry more weight in perception than in practical terms. For example, an Indian decision to abstain from a U.S. backed resolution at the United Nations may be less about changing the outcome of the vote and more about signaling to domestic audiences that the government is acting independently. Similarly, U.S. decision to delay a defense technology transfer might be more about demonstrating toughness to Congress than about fundamentally altering the defense partnership. These symbolic actions, while not always damaging in the long term, contribute to the public perception of each country standing up to the other. It is important to recognize that these domestic drivers do not necessarily undermine the broader relationship. In fact, they can strengthen it over time by ensuring